Hello, everyone. I'm Brian, one of the co-founders here at Bristle, and today I'm joined by my co-founder and the person who will do most of the speaking today, Dr. David Len, our Chief Scientific Officer at Bristle.
Hello.
And today we're going to do something a bit different. We're going to answer the internet's questions. So Dr. Andrew Huberman had put out a tweet saying he'd be answering all your oral health questions. We figured he probably won't have time to answer all of them. And as the oral microbiome experts wanted to make sure we took a stab at answering them ourselves. So we have David here today, and we're just going to go through all the questions that were put forth and give you our take on them. David, do you want to give a quick intro on you and your background?
Co-founder of Bristle. I've read a lot about the oral microbiome and how it affects your health. And so hopefully I can be of some service to answer some questions.
Also, PhD, has studied both the oral and gut microbiome and their relationship to our overall health. So uniquely qualified to answer questions. All right, so we'll just kick it off. These first questions are about flossing. So very straightforward to the point. How important is flossing, really?
Very important. So it's interesting because flossing is kind of this strange habit that we do now where we put things between our teeth to get rid of the stuff that's between your teeth. But the way that we had evolved thousands of years ago, prior to all these processed foods and processed carbohydrates, is we actually chewed fiber and we chewed our food, which was really tough, and that actually served as a flossing mechanism. And so back then, there wasn't an abundance of sugar, and people naturally flossed by chewing their food more. And so it turns out that now, because we don't do that so much, we eat a lot of sugary foods, we eat a lot of highly processed starches. It results in the leftover food being stuck between your teeth. So naturally, the way to get rid of that is to floss.
And it's relatively well known that there's not a lot of peer-reviewed, well-run studies on the effectiveness of flossing. So why do you say it's important, and why should people believe that flossing is important?
Yeah. So the first thing is that Bristle has done their own studies. So we've done our own internal studies that show the effect of flossing on the microbiome. And it turns out that people who floss generally have healthier microbiomes with fewer species that are associated with periodontal disease and fewer species that are associated with cavities. And this is really important because, of course, these bacteria are the drivers of disease. So there's specific bacteria that are pro-inflammatory and that live at the gum line. And flossing actually serves to to aerate your gums, to kill these bacteria that are anaerobic. So some of these bacteria, they really don't like the presence of oxygen. And by flossing, you actually remove the plaque that harbors those species. And it helps to introduce oxygen to the gum line. So we've done our own studies to show that flossing affects periodontal species and cavity-causing species.
And I think that's a point that's not all that well known that you mentioned, that most of the species, the bacterial species that drive gum disease in particular, and cavities, are anaerobic.
Mhm.
And it's not just to remove the food particles from in between your teeth, but that when you're actually going down into the gum line, flossing the correct way, you're actually exposing these species to oxygen, which kills them. That was something I hadn't realized when I was flossing for many years, but an important role of why you need to floss the right way.
Yeah, and this actually brings and ties in the next question, which is about water flossing versus regular flossing, because that aeration is really important. So one of the procedures that people do, that dentists do to prophylactically prevent people from getting worse gum disease, is they use this process called subgingival irrigation, which is essentially water flossing. And it's introducing liquid of a certain type into the pockets of your gums. And this serves to basically do that. It oxygenates the gum line. And in the office, there's different types of solutions that people use, and the most common one is hydrogen peroxide because it actually produces a lot of oxygen gas and it's highly reactive. And these anaerobic species are really bad at detoxifying hydrogen peroxide, and it kills them very quickly.
So, water flossing versus regular flossing,
Yeah,
is one better than the other? Should
yeah.
you do both? How should we think about water flossing versus string flossing?
Yeah, my recommendation generally is to do both now. String flossing is better at physically disrupting biofilm between teeth because you can the if you practice C-shaped flossing, then you can go between the teeth in a certain angle. That water flossing, generally, you don't have that much control. So our recommendation is generally to either alternate between them, or if you have a particular issue. So let's say you are suffering from gum recession and bleeding gums at one particular site in your mouth, then maybe you'll string floss most of your mouth, the between the teeth for most of your mouth, but then you will target the area of disease with a water pick. And you'll use diluted hydrogen peroxide in that area because that'll help to remove those species that cause the bleeding and that worsen your disease. And so by removing them, you can prevent the pocket from getting worse. You can prevent bleeding on probing. You can prevent bleeding in the future.
And when we say pocket, we're referring to the area of your gums that surround the tooth. So if you ever hear about pocket depth, that's referring to how deep your pockets are, how inflamed they are, which are generally used as analogs for measuring inflammation. Is that right?
Yeah. So sorry, we should define some of these terms. So the subgingival pocket is the space at the root of your teeth, and it has healthy gums generally have a certain depth. Okay. And so, when the dentist pokes and prods you, they're saying 2, 3, 2, 4. Those numbers are how deep that pocket is. And the deeper the pocket, the worse the disease generally. And this is for a variety of reasons. The main one is that inflammation can burrow deep into the gum line and actually cause bone loss. So there's another term called bone loss, and where these bacteria actually they go so deep in the pocket that they're damaging the root of your teeth. And that is an irreversible process. So once you lose bone at the bottom of your teeth, it can never come back. So generally what we try to do now is to prevent that from happening altogether. And so if you have 3 millimeter pockets, you're healthy. 4 millimeter pockets, you're kind of borderline. You're probably on the verge of getting worse disease because the pocket is deep. And 5 generally needs some type of therapy to repair.
And we can get into on another day if measuring millimeter pocket depths by hand is the most accurate way of measuring inflammation, but it is what it is today. So another question here, does flossing actually cause a longer life? And does it correlate with otherwise healthier people?
Ooh, this is an interesting question. So my first thought would just be that I don't think we have enough data to suggest that. That would require a very long study on people's habits over the course of decades. I don't think we have that kind of data, but it does correlate with healthier oral health, and healthier oral health correlates with healthier systemic health. So in general, you could draw the conclusion that flossing probably does result in better health outcomes and longer life potentially.
Okay, now we're going to shift over to brushing, the other traditionally most important part of oral health care. Electric versus old school brushes. Is it worth it to invest in an electric brush? Is there actually a difference?
Yes, there's a very big difference. First, I will preface this by saying that Bristle has run its own study, and we've asked this question to many people, and then we looked at their microbiomes and we looked at their oral health statuses, and we asked them, do you use an electric toothbrush or a regular toothbrush? And the people who use an electric toothbrush had higher levels of bacteria that are beneficial in the oral microbiome and lower levels of bacteria that cause periodontal disease and lower levels of cavities causing species. And this was very surprising to me because I didn't think there was a difference initially. Going in, I thought null hypothesis is there's no difference. This is just a marketing ploy, right? But when you look at the data, it actually says otherwise. And I think that the reason for this is really electric toothbrushes. The level of disruption of biofilm that you get from them is much higher than what you would get from a manual toothbrush, especially at the gum line, which is really important. So, traditionally when you floss, you are limited by the strength of the bristle and basically the speed of your own hand, right? But with an electric toothbrush, the vibration actually causes disruption by itself, and that can help to disrupt the plaque that is at your gum line and even between your teeth. So the hypothesis is that the electric toothbrush is better because of the rate of vibration, but I'm not sure that we actually know that yet.
Got it. So you mentioned biofilm and plaque. I think we have a problem with oral health education in this country. People are going to hear biofilm. People have heard plaque. People have heard tartar, and they know bacteria are implicated. Can you give a quick overview of how we go from looking at individual species and how that ends up, what is a biofilm? What is plaque? How does that lead to disease?
Yeah. In the future, we should probably pull up a picture of this. But basically, all bacteria, well, not all bacteria, most bacteria, they like to live in a home, just like people, just like most organisms. They like to be sheltered, right? And bacteria, no different. Bacteria, fungi, both of them, they stick to a surface and they create a little shell around them. And this home is called, initially, it's called the biofilm. Okay. And inside this biofilm, there can be different types of species. So it's not just one species, it's actually a community. So if one species is forming this biofilm, other species can swim in and then they take up residence, and there's an interesting interaction that happens between a lot of different species that can determine kind of the state of the biofilm, whether or not it's going to invade the tissue, whether or not it's going to cause a cavity, depending on the bacteria that live in this biofilm. And as biofilm ages, so biofilm gets older and older because this home starts to change in composition. So if you leave a home untouched, the roof will start to weather. Maybe you'll start to try to repair your home by sticking more tiles on top, by just adding bricks to the outside to like protect your house because maybe a window broke and now you're just patching it up. So this biofilm becomes more and more hard. It becomes weathered. And one of the things that happens is minerals become deposited in there and they become hard. So it becomes tartar, it becomes calculus. And plaque is kind of a term that we almost use interchangeably. And it may actually refer to a state somewhere between biofilm and calculus, because calculus is very difficult to remove, but plaque you can kind of disrupt by yourself. And so the plaque contributes to disease because the types of bacteria that live in the plaque will determine whether or not that community drives disease or is stable and maintains health, basically.
Awesome. And so when you hear about biofilm disruption, when you think about the importance of brushing, of flossing, it really is not just, again, to remove these food particles, but also to disrupt that process of that biofilm formation, and why you have to see your dentist regularly, because they actually have the tools to disrupt that harder tartar calculus, basically the solidified form of those biofilms that otherwise home care doesn't do a good job of addressing.
Yeah, I will also add that biofilm, so that feeling, that sticky feeling you get on your teeth is
Mhm.
biofilm, but it's not just on your teeth, it's also beneath the gum line. So it's in places you may not be able to reach very easily. This is why we have to floss, especially for people with existing disease, because if you have a deeper pocket, the biofilm may not actually be reachable using traditional string floss, which is why we recommend water flossing and using hydrogen peroxide to try to disrupt the biofilm.
And I think it also introduces, you had mentioned, certain species are more likely to come up and set up that biofilm. Some are more active at doing that, which is why, depending on the makeup of your oral microbiome, you might have more plaque than someone else, and you might regenerate plaque more regularly than someone else. But my understanding is that plaque generation or the presence of plaque isn't necessarily a one-to-one relationship with your likelihood of progression to oral disease. Some folks, no plaque buildup, can actually be at a pretty high risk of disease progression or in disease progression. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate. So there's an interesting observation if you look at animals. So there's like goats, for instance. Goats actually have a lot of plaque. So they don't really brush their teeth, but they masticate, right? So they chew highly fibrous foods, but they still have plaque, right? And it turns out that they don't get a lot of dental disease. A lot of animals actually don't get a lot of dental disease. So that really brings into question why is that the case? And so there's different hypotheses about immune statuses or the types of species that cause the disease, or I think the biggest one right now is probably diet. So the animal diet is very different from a current human diet, which is also different from a 1000 BC human. But yeah, there's healthy dental plaque. So most plaque is actually, in general, if it doesn't harbor the species that cause disease, it's actually probably beneficial for you because it helps to preclude other species from taking the space. But the way we treat plaque right now, because of the current human diet, is that all plaque is probably going to be detrimental if you leave it on your teeth for long enough because it will harbor the things that cause disease.
So this question gets asked all the time. I think anytime anyone from the dental field goes live, they're going to get this question. Is it better to brush before your breakfast or after your breakfast?
We need to stop brushing after we eat our food. Okay, that's in general, that's just like because the food we have today, of course, is has so much sugar in it and processed starches that brushing actually spreads that and will just help to coat it on your teeth. I think it also depends on what kind of diet you're eating. So if you're eating like high protein foods, or high fiber foods, it's probably okay to brush after breakfast as long as there's not that much sugar in it. The problem really arises because of the sugar, which is so common now which is why we recommend not brushing after you eat, because it will just spread the sugar.
And that's referring to immediately after eating, or how long after eating are you in that where the sugar and your enamel are in that softened state?
Yeah. Our recommendation right now is 30 minutes. You wait 30 minutes after you eat because you're constantly shedding saliva into your mouth, which helps to to basically wash the food out of your mouth. But there are some people who have very low salivary flow. And so what they might do is take a lozenge before they brush to try and stimulate saliva production to wash the food out of their mouth, or drink a cup of water. But our general recommendation is 30 minutes.
Thank you. And so brushing before, is any of the reason you'd want to brush before breakfast because you've had those bacteria building up overnight while you slept, and then it's really the introduction of the food to those bacteria that leads to acid production, or am I off base here?
That sounds like a very reasonable hypothesis. I'm trying to think of this scenario. So in this scenario, there you are leaving your mouth overnight, and generally that's like an 8-hour sleep cycle. Those bacteria are forming the biofilm there, and yep, right after, if you feed them directly after, then they will produce acid. If they can produce acid, they will ferment the sugar. So exactly similar for, well, I would say it's a little bit different for periodontal pathogens. So for the bacteria that cause gum disease, because that process is very slow, and takes a long time to develop. So hypothetically, if you fed those, you would also be increasing the level of the virulence factors that they can make to drive disease, but I don't know if there's a study that demonstrates that exactly.
Very helpful. Okay. Similar note. Is it true that it's beneficial for enamel protection to leave toothpaste in your mouth after brushing, or should you be rinsing after you brush?
You shouldn't rinse. You should leave it on your teeth. So it also depends what kind of toothpaste you're using. So today, there's probably 3 or 4 ingredients that are most common, active ingredients in toothpaste. The first is fluoride. The second is nanohydroxyapatite. The third one is xylitol. And the fourth one is probably less commonly mentioned. It's arginine. In all of these cases, it's probably beneficial to just leave it on your teeth, because the molecules, what they do is they help to remineralize your teeth, and in the case of arginine, it actually helps to change the pH on the surface of the teeth. So arginine helps to boost the pH and increase it, whereas in situations where the pH is lowered, you're more prone to cavities because lower pH dissolves your tooth. So to answer it directly, actually in every case, you should always leave the toothpaste on your teeth.
There we go.
Unless you use a toothpaste that doesn't have those 4 ingredients. Then you should be using a toothpaste that has one of those 4 ingredients.
Perfect. So next question, you mentioned xylitol. Xylitol, kind of a hot topic, buzzword, xylitol in health and wellness stores now. What does xylitol actually do in the oral microbiome? Why should we be interested in using xylitol?
Xylitol is such a fascinating molecule. So to start with, one of the big benefits of xylitol, outside of, independent of the oral microbiome, independent of microbiome in general, is that it's an inert sugar replacement. and it cannot be fermented. Okay. And sugar has multiple other detrimental effects on your body besides just causing cavities. It does a variety of other things involving inflammation, diabetes, metabolism. So in general, replacing sugar with xylitol is probably beneficial. And in multiple studies that have looked at the effect of xylitol on other metabolic functions, like it's generally inert to you. It's just great at replacing sugar because it still tastes sweet. But it turns out that xylitol actually does more than just taste good. Bacteria, they actually actively uptake xylitol, and it can bind to certain types of receptors that prevent the bacteria from fermenting sugar. So even if you also have sugar in your diet, by adding xylitol, you're reducing the level of fermentation. And fermentation is the process by bacteria that creates not only acid, but it also creates these foul-smelling chemicals like putrescine and cadaverine and hydrogen sulfide that smell bad, that cause halitosis. And so replacing sugar with xylitol can reduce all of those things.
Wonder sugar.
It is.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool. I definitely upped my intake after starting Bristle. Here's a question. Can xylitol toothpaste reverse cavities? Xylitol toothpaste or gum, can it reverse cavities?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about those ingredients. Xylitol alone does not reverse cavities. So xylitol only prevents the buildup of acid on the surface of teeth because it blocks the fermentation pathways. But what can help to reverse cavities is nanohydroxyapatite. So enamel is made of calcium. Nanohydroxyapatite is it's a form of calcium that is readily uptaken and can help to fix early cavities. Fluoride does something interesting in that it helps the uptake of calcium into the enamels. The enamel is actually like a matrix with living cells, and those cells form the enamel, and fluoride helps to boost that process. And then arginine increases the pH. So the process of remineralizing a tooth doesn't happen if the pH is low. So you can only deposit calcium if the pH goes up. So the reason for that is that calcium readily goes into solution with acid, but if there's a base there, then it actually becomes calcium carbonate. So it becomes limestone, basically. It becomes enamel. Yeah.
Very cool. I don't think a lot of people think of enamel as a living thing that can actually be modulated, but yeah. So this brings us to a very fun topic, a topic that has a lot of nuance that often is not addressed. And this question will tease us into it. Is mouthwash good or bad?
Oh gosh. Like everything in life, moderation. Okay. So one analogy that I use all the time now is antibiotics. So people are aware now of the detrimental effect of the use of antibiotics on your gut, right? So a lot of people who've taken antibiotics, systemic antibiotics, they end up with severe IBD, IBS, C. diff infections, and it's because taking an antibiotic disrupts the entire microbiome, and the things that come back are generally not the ones that were balanced, not the things that you started with. And so a mouthwash is very similar in that most have antimicrobials in them, and those antimicrobials just kill everything at random, and you don't really pick the things that are coming back. Then you end up with dysbiosis. You end up with severe imbalance, and you generally have to use mouthwash again to fix that. So you end up in this vicious cycle where you're like, oh, I'm just going to take mouthwash forever. Well, turns out people who use mouthwash twice a day, they are at higher risk of hypertension. Okay, and this study came about. Multiple studies came out over the course of the last decade that has shown that people that use mouthwash more frequently, they have lower levels of nitric oxide, which is a blood pressure regulating molecule. And a lot of the nitric oxide actually comes from your mouth because bacteria in your mouth, they can reduce nitrate, and that helps the process of forming nitric oxide. And the mouthwash kills those indiscriminately.
Got it. And yeah, I should also add not all mouthwash is created equal. There's some that are very broad spectrum and don't selectively target anything. There's some like chlorine dioxide that tend to be a bit gentler on certain areas of the oral microbiome. There's some that contain no antimicrobials, like you'll look at xylitol or some side of maintenance rinse. So it is more nuanced than just mouthwash, good or bad. But when we're talking about antimicrobial mouthwashes, everything what David said.
Yeah, everything in moderation, and it's not as general as it's good or bad.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, now we're moving into some oral systemic questions. So we say oral systemic, if you ever hear those terms, what we're referring to is the relationship of your oral health to your overall health, because for some reason those were pulled apart at some point. But do microbes, so microbes, bacteria, fungi, viruses that pertain to gingivitis cross through the blood-brain barrier? And if so, what are the implications long term?
This is so fascinating, and this is not general knowledge, unfortunately, even though it probably should be. So the thought was always that the blood-brain barrier was uncrossable, right? And that the only things that got in were blood cells, maybe some immune cells, and that keeps your brain kind of protected. But the mouth is in such close proximity and is constantly interacting with your brain. So it turns out that the bacteria that cause gingivitis, well, I don't want to say cause exactly, but the bacteria that are implicated in gingivitis, and there are dozens of them, have been detected in the brains of people. And in this observation, people had studied particularly patients with Alzheimer's disease, because they were interested in the process of Alzheimer's. Just why does this happen? And there's a very strong correlation between the bacteria, Porphyromonas gingivalis, and Alzheimer's disease. And not only in the mouth, but they found P. gingivalis in the brain. How that happens, there's a variety of hypotheses. The first is that P. gingivalis is fairly invasive, especially in combination with other inflammatory periodontal pathogens. And so P. gingivalis can readily basically break through the gum barrier into your bloodstream. And there, it may be able to translocate somehow by swimming through the bloodstream to get to the brain. The second hypothesis is that immune cells actually pick up Porphyromonas gingivalis, and they pick up Fusobacteria, and they pick up all these other species, and they travel along the bloodstream and in your lymph, and they're basically sampling stuff all the time. And some of those cells somehow survive the immune cell process, and they're just being taken up by a macrophage, and this macrophage then brings it up to the brain where these bacteria then reside. There were a few studies that had tried to look at whether or not disrupting that process, or certain types of proteins involved in that process, if you block them, what happens to disease? And I think some of those studies are still ongoing, and some of them actually turned out to be negative. So one particular protein formed by Porphyromonas gingivalis called the gingipane. So it's a protein that cuts other proteins. And this was thought to be one of the processes that might cause Alzheimer's disease. So there was a company that made a drug that blocked that process, but I think the most recent data was that it failed a clinical trial where there was no improvement in people with Alzheimer's disease. But it's possible that they didn't catch Alzheimer's early enough, right? Maybe if you catch it before the process happens at all, then it may be like a prophylactic, right? It may prevent the initiation of Alzheimer's disease, but we don't really know. Have to run the study.
Remains to be seen. And I think one of the things you mentioned that people don't often know is or think about is that since we've co-evolved with these microbes, the good and the bad, they've gotten very familiar with our immune system. And particularly these species that are related to gum disease are very familiar with how to interact with our immune system, even how to fool it, to hide from it, and modulate them, which why we see oral health associated with so many systemic conditions. It's usually these same kind of bad actors who are these microbes that are good at modulating the immune system. Can you speak about that a little bit and let us know what other systemic conditions are truly connected with oral bacteria and oral health?
Yeah, so I think you said it beautifully already. It's that these bacteria have co-evolved with us for thousands and thousands of years. They know us, and we actually use them a lot in the lab to study the immune system itself. Like people have challenged different types of uh, assumptions by basically using these microbes in combination with these immune cells and seeing what happens, right? And we find that a lot of them create these proteins that subvert the immune system, that they block the natural function of your immune system so that it can't kill those cells, or that it's less able to kill the cells. And this is why they're so good at living at the gum line and causing disease, because they just want to grow, right? They're no different from any other life form in that their natural process is to double all the time, and the way that they can double is by opening up more space. So they break into your gum line, they break into your teeth, and they just want to grow. And so through the thousands of years, they've created virulence factors and different types of methods to basically fool your immune system into allowing it to grow. There was a second half of that question.
The second half of the question was, we hear about associations a lot. I think for better or worse, sometimes 50 plus diseases that have been associated with oral health and the oral microbiome. I was curious, just, what are some of the most well studied or most well understood relationships between the oral microbiome, oral health, and our overall health?
Yeah. So the first, probably the most well studied, is the relationship between oral health and uh, IBD slash colorectal cancer. So there's this bacteria called Fusobacterium nucleatum, which is a little bit strange in that on its own, it doesn't really do that much. But in combination with other species, it's highly invasive. And somehow, in some inflammatory processes, it actually enhances the inflammatory environment. It triggers your immune system, and it actually likes that a lot. So it likes the inflammatory environment because it allows it to invade tissue. Fuso is really long chained rods, and these rods have been found inside of colorectal tumors. And there are a few studies that showed that the prognosis of the people who were positive for Fusobacterium, not only in their saliva, but also in the tumor, they had a much worse prognosis. So they were less likely to respond to treatment. They were more likely to have adverse outcomes and to live shorter lives. So that's the first one. So it's IBD slash colorectal cancer because they're kind of interlinked. Another really good one is, unfortunately, another cancer, pancreatic cancer. So there's a slew of studies now that show that that patients with pancreatic cancer have oral microbiome dysbiosis. So the hypothesis is that something that is driving inflammation in the mouth may be driving it in the pancreas and changing the environment there that allows those tumors to grow much worse. But a lot of that remains to be seen. The studies still have to be done. Another good one would be rheumatoid arthritis. So there's a lot of studies here now that show that oral bacteria may be the trigger for rheumatoid arthritis. They find that in the joints of patients with arthritis, that there's oral bacteria there. There's certain types of Prevotella intermedia. There's also maybe some interlinking with Porphyromonas gingivalis, maybe Fusobacterium. And we don't really know if they initiate disease or if they're just associated with worse disease, but we know that there's an association there. Let's see, there's another really good one, adverse pregnancy outcomes. So this started with the observation that mothers who had gum disease actually have worse outcomes for either preeclampsia or early term pregnancy, low birth weight pregnancies, things like that. And it turns out that some of the bacteria actually end up at the placenta. They traverse through the whole body and they end up at the placenta and they can cause inflammation. It's a very interesting story, very similar to the blood-brain barrier. The thought was always that the placenta could never be crossed because it's an immune restricted area, but people have found bacteria there, so that they may be implicated in the cause of some of those adverse pregnancy outcomes. I think those are the top ones. I'm sure there are dozens more really good associations, but those are the top of mind.
Yeah, and I think those stand out in particular because you can actually, in these studies, have actually, in some instances, found the bacteria
Yeah.
in the site of interest. Part of the reason there's so many associations around the body is that when you have active gum disease or when you have active inflammation in the mouth, these immune cells don't just stay there or leave and then calm down. Basically, they're sending warning signals that there's inflammation and there's infection active in your mouth. But the activity of these immune cells doesn't stop in the mouth. And so it sets you into sort of a hyper-inflamed state where even around the rest of your body, your immune cells are now on high alert. And you don't normally want them on high alert because when the immune system is too active, that's where you tend to see autoimmune diseases or you see certain things happening that shouldn't be. So really, when you have this active, burning fire in your mouth of inflammation, it won't just stop in the mouth. So even if you don't find those bacteria there, that's part of the reason we see inflammation being such a key driver in so many diseases linked to oral health.
Absolutely. Very well said.
Thank you.
Very, very well said.
All right, we are now in the miscellaneous topic category. So these didn't fit clean into the brushing and flossing. The first one is, and this is a question we get a lot at Bristle, are there risks to wearing a mouth guard at night for your oral health? And how should you clean it?
Yes. Well, I think it depends on what kind of mouth guard you're using. It also depends if you're mouth breathing because you're wearing a mouth guard. Mouth breathing dries your saliva, and that makes the process of cleaning your mouth all the time not efficient. So it depends on that. How should you clean it? Very thoroughly. It also depends where you store it. So when we started Bristle, I was very surprised to find that fecal oral contamination is actually incredibly common. So we find that a lot of people who suffer from halitosis and suffer from oral disease actually have bacteria that normally colonize the gut and the colon in their mouths. And if you look at the studies, it shows that this happens because of storing your toothbrush and your mouth guard too close to the toilet. So our recommendation now is store them in a cabinet or store them at least 6 feet away from the toilet or in another room, because every time you flush the toilet, you're aerosolizing whatever's in the toilet every time.
Fun topic, but thank you for that one. Someone who might have been frustrated with some dental work asked, should we just replace our teeth with fake teeth and call it a day?
Yeah, we should just not eat at all. Like we should just use IVs. We have the technology now, right? No, but your teeth are alive. Your teeth are living. They help you sense how hard you're biting. They help you talk. They help you communicate. Replacing them with teeth that don't feel will disrupt all of that. We evolved as humans. We evolved this way because of the way we communicate, and your teeth are just important for that in general. And eating requires teeth, and you feel what you eat. You're probably not actively thinking about it when you're chewing, but you know how hard you're chewing. You know how hard to bite into a piece of bread or versus a piece of celery versus ice cream. And it's because your teeth are alive and you actually feel it. If you replace them entirely, you don't do that anymore. It's not the same.
Yep. It's also just one piece of the equation. Most of the conversation today has been around gum health. If you don't have a good way to replace gums, you should try to keep them as long as you can. Yes. And also, if you look up the price of full mouth implants, that will probably assuage you from.
Not to mention that the failure rate of an implant by 5 years is about 20%. So replacing all your teeth with fake teeth with titanium inserts, it's not that you just replace them and you don't maintain them. You still have to maintain them. There's still bacteria at the gum line that can drive the loss of an implant.
Yep. And look up your dental insurance. It does not function the same way as medical insurance. So when you need to get those implants replaced, it will not be just a cursory expense. I'm going to skip down to one. How do Zens, which is a brand of nicotine pouches, impact health?
Ryan, I think you might be the best to answer this. You wrote the first blog almost ever on this.
I did, but I want your answer on it. How do nicotine pouches impact our oral health?
Nicotine is a fascinating molecule. So early on, there was the observation that nicotine was a depressant. right? Very good at calming people down. Smoking, chewing tar, like all of that calms you down. It doesn't just calm down your mental state, it calms down the entire immune system. And it's an immunosuppressant. So it makes your whole immune system not function properly. And by chewing tobacco or by smoking nicotine, you are putting your immune system in a hindered state so that it can no longer prevent the outgrowth of bacteria. And that makes the milieu favorable for those species. So now they're more inclined to cause disease.
Right. So just to reiterate on that, better than tobacco pouches, better than chewing tobacco, but still will present risks to your oral health. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. This next question just says tongue scraping. Elaborate. Yeah, tongue scraping. Which I'm sure some people may be hearing it for the first time or asking the same thing. What is the point of tongue scraping? Does it actually do anything?
Is that? Yeah. The surface of your tongue is actually coated with these little villi, and there's thousands of them. Okay. And within them, there are pockets, and those pockets also harbor biofilm, very similar to the rest of your mouth. So these bacteria, they don't just colonize teeth and then say, "Oh, this is where I'm at. This is where I live forever. I'm living on this tooth forever, and I'm just gonna come back here every single time." No, they go everywhere in your mouth. So your saliva is shedding from thousands of salivary glands constantly throughout the day. What's the stat? You swallow a liter, maybe more than a liter of saliva every day, and it goes down your tongue. So the bacteria, they actually have a reservoir on your teeth and on your gums and on your tongue. So if you don't clean your tongue and you have oral disease, those bacteria will just end up going back. The high abundance of them will just end up in the same. You'll end up in the same situation because you have this reservoir of pathogens on your tongue.
And one of the cool features David developed with our test at Bristle is if you have your halitosis score, it can tell you if you are more prone to, and if you have halitosis that's likely coming from the tongue coating species. I myself do have tongue coating species, so I tongue scrape twice a day. So yeah, great insight there. I think we can probably rapid fire a couple of these. Rinsing with salt and baking soda. Does that do anything?
I don't really know. I think it depends on the concentration of salt. It depends on the concentration of baking soda. It depends. I mean, on its own, it's probably inert. It's probably nothing. You're eating food with salt all the time. Baking soda is just calcium. A lot of toothpaste have calcium carbonate in it, baking soda to help remineralize your teeth. It's probably nothing. It's definitely not as detrimental as a general mouthwash. It's probably fine.
So if people want to rinse their mouths with something every day, they just like the sensation or for whatever reason they feel it's important to them, what should they be rinsing their mouth with?
Ooh, let's say you don't know what's in your oral microbiome. The most common issues are issues of gum disease and cavities. And in the case of gum disease, which is a long process, the probably one of the most effective mouth rinses is chlorine dioxide. So it's similar to hydrogen peroxide, and that creates oxygen gas, chlorine. And this helps to aerate the places that need oxygen and kill anaerobes. And for cavities, to prevent cavities, you can rinse with xylitol. Xylitol will coat your teeth and prevent those species from fermenting sugar and creating acid. So something with both of those would be good.
Okay. And I love the call out that if you don't know what is in your oral microbiome, that's when you might want to look that way, but test your oral microbiome. It's a great way to find out what's going to be optimal for you. Last question, because I know I've been rapid firing, hitting you with questions. What are the three best things you can eat to nurture the beneficial bacteria in your mouth?
Okay.
And then what are one or two things you should be avoiding that you might not be thinking about?
Okay. Three best things. So cavities are rampant, and the way to boost beneficial bacteria is through eating foods high in nitrate. It's like leafy greens, So foods high in nitrate. Another way to get down to the nitrate pathway is eating foods that are high in a protein amino acid called arginine. I talked about this earlier. As arginine also increases the pH locally on the surface of your teeth. So that actually serves two purposes. So arginine's beneficial. And the last one, we've talked about it like 1,000 times, it's just replace the sugar. Try not to eat the sugar. If you really have a sweet tooth, replace it with a lozenge that has xylitol, sorbitol, erythritol, one of those non-fermentable sugars, because the reason that the cavity rate is so high is because of sugar and its effect on the oral microbiome. Yeah.
Yeah, right answer. And I would just add simple carbohydrates, also sugars. So goldfish crackers,
Sugars.
a lot of crackers.
Still sugar.
Be conscious of those. They're very sticky. To the first question we answered here, they like to get stuck in between your teeth and on your teeth and all around, and they're very easy to ferment into acids. Awesome. David, thank you so much. This was very helpful. Hopefully everybody got some good takeaways from this. And be sure to check out the real Andrew Huberman episode once that drops, because I know he'll go very in depth, very much like we have. But yeah, thanks again, David.
Thank you, Brian.
All right, see ya.